So I wanted to start this video off just addressing the elephant in the room. I have been gone the last couple days from YouTube, and the reason for that was I've developed this abscess on my lip, and upon getting it checked out, I was told that it was an aggressive form of an STD. It's highly contagious, non-curable, and yeah, but, fuck it, right? The show's got to go on. So today we will be answering MMA's greatest what-if matchups. The fights that we were so close to getting that just never materialized and everybody speculates about to no end. Starting off, we have Tony versus Khabib. I think at this point, most people are of the mind that Tony Ferguson, in hindsight, was never going to beat Khabib. And I think that's just because of how his career ended up unfolding. And look, of course, I'm a ride or die Khabib fan. I've always been. I'll defend him to no end. So look, I get it. I might not be the most trustworthy source on this, but look, I do think that's accurate to a certain extent. But what's interesting about this matchup is they were matched up 5 separate times. So where you pick out when they were supposed to fight is where things get interesting. And the very first time in particular was supposed to be December 11th, 2015. And I think this version of Khabib back then is very different than, prime Khabib later on. But Tony Ferguson during this time frame was full swing. I mean, he was the best he has ever been. And I think it is very, very easy to forget how much of a motherfucker prime Tony Ferguson was. But he fought Edson Barboza the night that he was supposed to fight Khabib. And holy shit, he was terrifying. He was very, very scary. I mean, honestly, it's just how fucking fast he was. I mean, that's the crazy part. He was so fast. The amount of pressure he put on Edson Barboza was absolutely insane. He basically just sprinted at him, got in his face, never took his foot off the gas, and just the constant attacks. The Imanari roll was so fast. It's so difficult to deal with. I mean, honestly, it would have been very interesting to see how Khabib dealt with this style of grappling, because the thing is, right, of course, and I get it, right, I'm a Khabib super fan, but I will gauge his skill set fairly and accurately. Khabib Nurmagomedov was the best in the world at takedowns up against the fence and mat returns and riding you from the back. If you were trying to stand back up against Khabib against the fence, I mean, you were fucked. I mean, nobody could do it. He was the best in the world at just keeping you there and putting you back down. But this Tony Ferguson right here was so springy, so wiry and explosive, and he was just constantly scrambling. He wasn't necessarily trying to get back up, but he was, again, going to leg entanglements and just hammer fisting you from the bottom. He was going for reverse full guard. And again, just trying to hammer fist you from the bottom. It's very unorthodox, unique positions that just frankly, you don't really see most people in, and a lot of people just don't know how to deal with it. So, I mean, look, it would have been interesting to see Khabib deal with these types of guards, but I'll be honest. Again, I know, Khabib super fan, but I'm just being honest. I think if Tony Ferguson was trying to grapple with Khabib at all, it probably just wasn't going to go well for him because of the fact that Tony Ferguson relied very heavily on his attributes, on his springiness, on his cardio on the ground, because he did kind of lack fundamentals. And I think the best example of this was the Kevin Lee fight. Kevin Lee just frankly dominated Tony on the ground early in that fight because he just had better fundamentals. Tony, would be in full guard. He would kind of throw his legs up, trying to make something happen even though nothing was really there, which would get his guard past and just put himself into bad positions. We all love Tony Ferguson for this style, for this kind of carelessness on the ground, but a really high-level grappler who just has superior fundamentals and can kind of match Tony's wiriness and explosiveness and strength is just going to eat him alive. And that's exactly what Kevin Lee did. Just punished Tony for it, was able to mount him. Again, right, Khabib Nurmagomedov on the ground with Tony was going to smash him. I just think when you look at the success that prime Tony would have on the ground, it almost always came from the fact that he was overwhelming his opponent from the bottom, which is why wildly impressive. But, again, you look at the Kevin Lee fight, Kevin dominated early, and then when Tony began having success on the ground, it was because Kevin was fading, he was fatiguing. I don't think Khabib is going to gas out from on top. I don't think he's ever going to get overwhelmed. But when we look at that very first matchup back in 2015, I think it would have been difficult for Khabib to take Tony down. And that's because, of course, Khabib's takedowns opened up very specifically against the fence. I mean, we all know that. And the thing about this Tony Ferguson was, he legitimately was the boogeyman. Because you look at these shots that he was eating from Edson Barbosa. He was just, again, fucking going after him. Got right in his face, was not taking a step back. And Edson was cracking him. And Tony was just walking right through it. This Khabib Nurmagomedov back then, the closest fight he had was against RDA. And that fight was very impressive, but Khabib's striking was not anywhere near what it ends up being later on. Here, he kind of just purely relied on physicality and pressure to get RDA to back up, whereas later in his career, he was lunging in, landing clean combinations in order to pressure guys, to get them to cover up, back up, which then opened up the takedowns. But here, against RDA, he's just not nearly as clean. He's just winging his shots, throwing flying knees, sprinting at him. And, because of the tremendous pressure, he's able to land, and it's working clearly. But you compare this to, when he fought Gaethje, for a good example, the pressure there was insane as well, but his striking was so much cleaner. He was popping him with the jab, landing 1-2s. He was just far more dangerous there. So I just think take this version of Khabib against this version of Tony Ferguson, it would have been really difficult to try to overwhelm Tony, to try to get in his face and make him wilt to pressure. I just don't think that's happening. I think Tony would have met him right in the middle, and of course, there's a couple of things that Tony was so dangerous with here. For one, his Darce legitimately was pretty terrifying. Again, Khabib is not a great wrestler out in the open, and if you just put your neck in a bad position off a shitty shot out in the open, Tony is going to put you in a Darce. The way he was doing it to Edson, it was very fast, and it was a problem. And of course, on the feet, Tony was the better striker. He had one-punch knockout power, and based on the RDA fight, Khabib would respect guys striking. When you would go after him with punches, he would respect it. He would try to evade. It's the reason why he had never gotten knocked out. If Tony Ferguson tried to put the pressure on him, he was dangerous. Khabib would have respected the striking. And look, again, I think that if there was a sequence where they end up on the ground, Khabib was going to get the better of the exchange. But again, I don't think this young version of Khabib would have been able to capitalize on a lot of the strengths that he'll have later in his career. Again, because Tony Ferguson out in the open was such a scrambly motherfucker. You get a hold of him, and he just immediately jumps in the air, does a fucking spin, and it's very unorthodox, very difficult to deal with. I think that if Tony can keep the fight out in the open, he does have a lot of advantages here. Especially because, again, when you look at this Dagestani kind of grappling, what they capitalize on is just breaking you. Their positional control is so strong that they just fatigue you, they break your spirit, they break you mentally, and once you're fatigued and done and want out of there, then they take whatever submission is left open. But you're not breaking this version of Tony Ferguson. You're just not doing it. I think that no matter what, Tony is going to be constantly fighting, constantly scrambling, throwing elbows off of his back, and of course, like I said, Khabib will be winning the exchanges on the ground. He's just far more technical there, but it does give Tony some leeway if some kind of scramble happens one or two times and he ends up on the bottom. And look, I think when it comes to this very first matchup, again, I think you can kind of go back and forth with it a little bit. I think as long as Tony Ferguson had a very particular game plan for this fight where he knew he had to keep his back off of the fence no matter what, he had to go forward, I think that even if Khabib landed, Tony would have just ate it and kept going. He would have stayed in Khabib's face, and I think he was the better striker. I think out in the open, I think his scrambling ability was good enough to avoid getting to the ground, and I think honestly you can give this fight to Tony. Now, with that being said, every other time they were matched up, Tony didn't stand a chance. I mean, all the other 4 times they were supposed to fight, Tony was never going to win. Because Khabib legitimately did develop into a decent striker. I mean, nothing like Islam Makhachev, but he had timing. He was fairly accurate. It didn't look the cleanest, but Tony Ferguson at times would kind of leave himself open. He was there to get hit. And yeah, he had an amazing chin. He can walk through shots, but you can't just let Khabib hit you. Especially when you mix in the fact that if the Kevin Lee fight is anything to take an example from, Kevin seemed a lot stronger than Tony. He seemed a lot more technical. And of course, Khabib is going to be, at the very minimum, exactly the same in all of those areas. And he's not going to gas like Kevin Lee did as that fight went on, which eventually opened up the triangle. So look, there's really no question Khabib was going to smash Tony any other time they got matched up. Next, we have a personal favorite what if of mine, which is, what if Conor McGregor ended up giving Jose Aldo the rematch? Again, right, Jose Aldo just kind of decided 10 seconds in to kind of just blitz Conor face first, which, of course, that is Conor's ideal. That is what you don't want to do against him. I mean, he was a phenomenal counterpuncher. So, I mean, what if Jose Aldo just didn't do that? What if he tried to fight intelligently? I mean, would have Conor had any shot of winning? Well, honestly, I'm not going to beat around the bush with this one. No. I mean, Jose Aldo, I don't think stood a chance. I think he was always going to lose to Conor McGregor. And it just comes down to the fact that Jose Aldo, throughout his entire career, and, especially back when he was fighting Conor, he is very stationary. And that is just how he fights. He utilizes a pretty classic Thai stance, which just doesn't utilize a whole lot of movement. You have a high guard, light on that front leg, and the problem with that is Conor McGregor fought in a karate stance, and I think there's some fundamental issues in danger when you match those two up together. And for the karate stance, it allows you to move forwards and backwards so much faster than a classic Muay Thai stance. And when you look at Conor McGregor's game of sliding out of the way and catching you coming in, that is where it starts to kind of become an issue for Jose Aldo here. Again, for the Muay Thai stance, well, you have the leg kick against the karate stance because they're standing sideways. But not against Conor because he's a southpaw. It really is just not a great fundamental matchup here for Jose Aldo. I mean, Jose, throughout his entire career, what he likes to do is really sit down on his punches and throw bombs. And, look, it is a problem because Jose hits so hard. He was very fast and explosive. But against Conor McGregor, he was going to have to, at some point, try to move forward with punches. And, again, I don't think in a rematch he was ever going to gift Conor anything as clean as he did in the first fight. But, again, he was going to have to blitz him at some point. That's just what Jose Aldo did. And, unfortunately, he's fighting a guy who really has every single advantage here when it comes to counterpunching. Height and reach. I think Max Holloway can kind of mimic Conor's reach a little bit. He's a bit taller. His arms are shorter, though. And, of course, Jose Aldo had to just kind of extend in, blitz forward, and try to land bombs. Now, Max Holloway does not have the same style as Conor McGregor, but point is, no matter what, Jose was going to have to extend forward with punches. And I just think matchup-wise, he doesn't match up with Conor well at all. Because Conor, especially down at 145, he had real one-punch knockout power. I mean, Conor was massive for 145. I don't think he's ever had the same kind of power at 155. And I think, look, no matter what, Jose was going to have to try to close the distance, and that's just kind of playing into Conor's game, and I think Conor was going to land, and he was going to hurt him at some point. I just don't think there's any real question there. I mean, maybe some people would say, well, Conor, though, has a cardio problem. Maybe if Jose Aldo just tried to wait until the later rounds, Conor would start slowing down. I mean, potentially, but I think that the only real example you have of Conor really fatiguing is the Nate Diaz fight. And the thing about the Nate Diaz fight was Conor McGregor went from 145 immediately all the way up to 170 on short notice. he was landing, a ton of serious bombs on Nate Diaz, who was just eating it and walking forward because, he was a welterweight pretty much. And, going up against a guy that big who's constantly trying to pressure you, eating your best punches, yeah, that's going to be very fatiguing. But I don't think there's a lot of other clear examples of Conor like really gassing out apart from that, especially not down at 145. When Conor fought Max Holloway, that fight went all 3 rounds, and he did not fatigue really badly in that fight because, Max Holloway's not a welterweight just fucking walking through him and trying to overwhelm him like Nate Diaz did. I mean, I don't even think he was as fatigued against Khabib round 4 as he was against Nate Diaz round 2 of their first fight. And also, I mean, Jose Aldo himself was not known for cardio in the later rounds because, again, he was so explosive. He tried to really sit down on his punches. So I just don't think there's a great argument the other way. And next we have, what if Francis Ngannou stayed with the UFC? Jon Jones finished bulking up to heavyweight like he was planning on, and instead of fighting Ciryl Gane, Jon Jones faced Francis Ngannou. Now, the big thing about this matchup is, of course, and it's something that I have discussed in the past, is the fact that, frankly, Jon Jones is kind of at a disadvantage here because he's not a natural heavyweight. I mean, he's just not. Francis Ngannou fights at his best up to 270 pounds, whereas Jon Jones, when he takes 3 years off to bulk up, he comes into the fight fat, slow, just, awkward. And, despite what he'll tell you, because he promised John Anik that
Jones has said all week he's still moving like a light heavyweight.
He's not. I mean, just fucking look at him. He looks like a fucking fat tortoise. Of course, though, when it comes to pure grappling, this size is very important. And I think that's the reason why Jon needed to bulk up to this amount if he wanted any chance of fighting Francis. And of course, when it comes to Ciryl Gane, Jon knew he was not going to try to strike with Ciryl. He knew he needed to take him down where he was going to have a massive advantage. So that's why he felt like he needed to be that big. So look, if Jon were able to get Francis to the ground, I mean, again, he's going to have a huge advantage. I mean, his ground and pound is absurd. His submission ability just blows Francis's out of the water. But, I mean, again, it's a big question. Can he actually get him down? Well, when you just look at Francis's pure takedown defense, I don't think there's a definitive answer. I think we haven't seen enough from him to be certain. Again, his takedown defense looked fine against Stipe Miocic, who weighed 230 pounds. But again, he was outsized by such a significant margin that it was going to always be ridiculously hard to take down a 270-pound man. So I don't think that's an example enough to say certainly yes or no. But the one area that I do think is really telling here would be, can Jon Jones actually pressure Francis? I mean, that's the big question. Because Francis Ngannou is not going to want to be on the back foot against Jon Jones. And if Jon cannot pressure him, if he can't get him to back up, I think it's going to be really difficult for him to actually complete takedowns. When Jon fought Stipe most recently, Stipe didn't really have a choice to be anywhere but the back foot because Jon had essentially every single advantage in that fight except for the pure boxing. But against Francis Ngannou, I don't think that's the case. I think that Francis is still going to be bigger than Jon. I mean, even when Jon spent 3 years bulking up, I mean, he got up to 248. All right, that's not going to be as big as Francis. He's going to have a size advantage, which of course is going to really aid in Ngannou's durability, and it's not going to make him nearly as willing to back up when Jon Jones tries to throw any kind of a strike. And of course, Jon against Stipe had some horrible moments of boxing defense. Of course, though, what's important to mention here is that because Stipe was just absolutely docile in that fight, because there was zero threat of any kind of knockout, of any, he just was completely and utterly lacking any kind of speed and power because Stipe was a complete shell of himself. Of course John wasn't super worried about it. Of course there were moments where he wasn't evading like he should have. If he was fighting Francis Ngannou, he would be way more careful than he was against Stipe. So I don't think the comparison is 1-to-1. I mean, there were tons of moments where John was kind of moving away, Stipe was coming forward, and John kind of, I don't think he meant to get hit, but he also just wasn't super concerned about it. But there were some moments of just pure instinct from Jon Jones that's shocking. That's really, really bad. And this is something that John has done throughout his career, which is kind of extend his arms outward when guys try to move forward with punches. And again, you can't do this against Francis Ngannou. I mean, look at these examples right here. I mean, both of these are terrible. I mean, you look here, John has his chin up in the air, both arms extended outwards. The only reason he didn't get clipped right on the chin was just because Stipe's arms are so short. And then John turns his back and then runs away. I mean, it's sequences like this that really make you, kind of start leaning towards Ngannou here. Because Ngannou, if you give him this, which again, this is just instinctual from Jon Jones, I mean, he's getting knocked out. Of course, in the striking, Jon Jones is at his best in kicking range. Just outside of the pocket where he's spamming kicks to the body, using his reach to kind of stay away from you. And, from there, he's a motherfucker no matter who he's fighting. But again, the problem is I just don't see a reliable way for him to prevent Francis from just keeping him on the back foot. I don't think Francis would be trying to overwhelm him. I don't think he'd be trying to blitz forward and run into takedowns. I think he would just try to hold the center, and I think that is going to make that kind of style that Jon Jones likes, of right outside the pocket, spamming kicks. It's just not going to work super well because he's not going to be able to get Ngannou on the back foot. It's going to really limit his ability to find takedowns. It's going to limit his kicking game. And I think, of course, in boxing range, I think he's fucked against Francis. I mean, honestly, I think potentially Tom Aspinall might be a better matchup for John than Francis. Just because Tom likes to blitz with a hard right hand. He wants to really step in and use his speed and put all of his body weight behind it. Well, look, that's the perfect opportunity to, again, just duck right underneath it, make him run into takedowns. But when you look at how Ngannou approached the fight with Stipe, the way he was very patient, the way he held the center, the way he was really trying to set up his right hand, I think it's going to be really difficult for Jones. And I think that, Jones is going to kind of have to try to potentially just spam takedowns. I think it's going to be tough against a bigger, stronger guy. If he takes Francis down, I think he's got it. But for the most part, I think that's going to be a lot easier said than done as long as Francis fights, very intelligently, which I think based on some of his last few performances, he absolutely would. And I think, honestly, Francis Ngannou's probably taken that fight. And now, moving on to the final matchup of the day. Honestly, probably the greatest what-if fight that we never got to see. It's the number one question that I get asked, and that is, in their primes, GSP versus Khabib, who's taking it? Of course, for starters, right, weight class is an interesting question here because GSP fought at 170, Khabib fought at 155. But here's the thing. As the sport of MMA has evolved and grown over time, fighters cut more weight than they used to. The fact of the matter is, Khabib and GSP walked around at the exact same weight. Both of them would get up to about 190, 195. Look, if Khabib was fighting during GSP's era, he'd be a welterweight. If GSP was fighting during Khabib's era, he'd be a 55er. I mean, that's just how it is. So, frankly, they're the exact same size. So, I mean, whatever. Just let them fight at whatever open weight they want to. And look, of course, I want to preface, I understand, I am a diehard Khabib Nurmagomedov supporter. I've been repping him and his team for as long as I can remember. So, I understand some people are going to call me biased with my analysis here, but I want to be completely fair. I think that, honestly, a lot of people don't represent Khabib's skill set very accurately. I think that there are very particular things that he does that he was the best in the world at, no question. But most people just kind of look at him as this sort of all-around greatest grappler ever, and he had no weaknesses no matter what, anywhere on the ground. I don't think that's true. I think Khabib very specifically utilized Sambo/judo-style takedowns up against the fence, and then once he would get you down, he would use Folk-style techniques for pinning and mat returns. If you were on your knees, turtled up against the fence, trying to stand back up against Khabib, you were going to have problems no matter what. I mean, he was the best in the world at mat returns and just fucking riding you from the back. But of course, look, GSP was a very intelligent fighter who was a master at coming up with game plans, and he has been very vocal about how he would approach a fight with Khabib. And here's what he basically says.
How would you solve the Khabib Nurmagomedov puzzle?
Well, Khabib is very good against the fence. I would have to establish a game plan and everything, but I think what I would need it to do is take the center of the octagon right away. Use a lot of feint and fate. Keep the fight all the way out or all the way in. And when I say all the way in is when you close the gap, use my proactive and reactive takedown and perhaps my superior explosivity to put him down.
And look, I mean, that is very, very spot on, right? You have to keep the fight out in the center. You got to keep your back off of the fence. And I think, look, if anybody can do this, it would have been GSP, no question. I mean, look, GSP truly was arguably the most well-rounded fighter the sport's ever seen. I mean, you know, he was taking down Division I All-American wrestlers at will. He was outstriking amazing strikers, throwing spinning wheel kicks, spinning back kicks. His fucking jab was so nasty. I mean, he really didn't have any holes in his game. And I think that a big area where he has an advantage over Khabib is the reactive takedowns. Khabib had proactive takedowns. He needed to get you into a very particular position, and from there he would shoot automatically, and you were in trouble. Whereas GSP was so good at timing his takedowns on specific moments to make you run into them. You look at the Johnny Hendricks fight, and now, you know, Johnny Hendricks, he was a real 170er. I mean, he outweighed GSP by a good 15 pounds. I mean, he was massive. And of course, he was a ridiculously high-level wrestler. But you look at some of these takedowns that he was timing on him. As soon as Hendricks extended with a shot, he would duck right underneath it, put him flat on his back. And now you look at how Khabib would pressure guys up against the fence, and it would come from him being on the outside, out of range, and he would time his moments to blitz in with combinations. And again, it was very fast, and Khabib legitimately had good timing, and he had developed his striking to a point that it was a problem, and you had to respect it. Guys would cover up, they would be forced to back up, and that's where the takedowns opened up. But you can't just blitz at GSP like this. This is the ideal scenario for GSP to duck right underneath it, make you run into the takedown, and put you flat on his back. The way that Khabib would pressure guys, it just opens up GSP's takedowns too much. And look, put GSP on his knees up against the fence with Khabib behind him with a body lock. I think GSP's in trouble. I think, again, from that position right there, Khabib was the best in the world. I don't think necessarily Khabib was going to finish him from that position, but I think it would have been really hard for GSP to get back up. But, look, I think that's going to be really difficult to get him into a position like that. You go back to the Al Iaquinta fight, there were many moments in that fight where Khabib struggled getting takedowns. Now, Joe Rogan famously just kind of, when he referenced this fight, he would just say, oh, that was the one time we've seen Khabib slow down. It wasn't that he slowed down. It was just that Iaquinta just wasn't backing up. He was staying in the center, and therefore Khabib really struggled getting takedowns. Up against the fence, it was no problem. Just lift the single leg, go for the trip over and over and over again. But out in the open, he really struggled. He kept going for a low single leg, over and over and over again. And every single time out in the open, Al Iaquinta had no problem defending because, again, for Khabib's takedowns to be effective, he needs to be up against the fence. He is not nearly as strong of a wrestler out in the open as he is up against the fence. I just don't see a reliable way for Khabib to pressure GSP and get him up against the fence. Look, GSP, again, was very well aware of what he needed to avoid doing, which was allowing Khabib to back him up. The way Khabib would blitz just opened up the reactive takedowns. Just in terms of straight up striking out in the open, GSP was way better. His boxing was very good. He spent many years working with Freddie Roach. He had a really good jab. And of course, if you're very jab heavy, you're going to turn that into a left hook. His kicking game was absurd. And I just think, again, there were very particular aspects of Khabib's game that he was the best in the world at, no question. But when you look at the matchups against, Conor McGregor, Dustin Poirier, Justin Gaethje, these guys just could not contend with him on the ground at all. They were helpless in that area. So Khabib's game just opened up so well against them. But I really think GSP has the answer to a lot of these issues that Khabib provides. And I just think that, look, it hurts to say this because, again, I am such a super fan of Khabib Nurmagomedov. But honestly, GSP should be a pretty heavy favorite in a matchup against him.